This is the Dilemmas on Screen, a Jewish perspective podcast, where we take ambiguous moral situations in fictional popular movies and TV shows and analyze them from a Torah lens. As a quick overview, Harry Potter is a wizard whose parents were murdered when he was a year old. Harry's only living relative was his mother's sister, Petunia. Albus Dumbledore, the Headmaster of Hogwarts, is the most powerful wizard alive and was very close to Harry's parents. Professor Dumbledore decided Harry should be raised by his aunt and her husband, Vernon. When Professor McGonagall learns of Dumbledore's decision, she protests and notes how different Petunia's family is from wizards, and how Harry will grow up not knowing that he is a wizard, or anything about the wizarding world, or that Harry is already a legend. Nonetheless, Dumbledore decides to leave Harry there. Dumbledore wins out, and Harry ends up living with his aunt, her husband, and their child Dudley, who is the same age as Harry, for the next 10 years. Harry was often underfed and was verbally and emotionally abused, and was even under threat of physical abuse by his family, and was often given a significant amount of housework and other chores. Harry eventually learns that he's a wizard, and off he goes to Hogwarts. Nonetheless, after every school year, Harry would go back to his aunt's house during summer break. In the beginning of Book 6, Dumbledore arrives at the Dursleys to pick Harry up, and says the following: "I left him upon your doorstep 15 years ago, with a letter explaining about his parents' murder and expressing the hope that you would care for him as though he were your own. You did not do as I asked. You have never treated Harry as a son. He has known nothing but neglect and often cruelty at your hands. The magic I evoked 15 years ago means that Harry has powerful protection while he can still call this house home. However miserable he has been here, however unwelcome, however badly treated, you have at least grudgingly allowed him house room." That's what Dumbledore says to the Dursleys. Overall, Harry stayed with his aunt for 16 years, though the last 6 were only during the summers. The Dursleys, however, are susceptible to danger due to Harry's presence. For example, in Book 5, at the beginning, a magical attack was directed at Harry, and Dudley was caught up in the mix. Harry's uncle, to protect his family, was going to chuck Harry out of the house. Dumbledore sent a screaming magical message warning Petunia to remember her promise. Petunia insisted, against her husband's wishes and without explaining why, that Harry stay. Uncle Vernon acquiesces, and Harry does, in fact, stay. It is also important to ask, why did Dumbledore place Harry with such miserable, unloving people? Dumbledore himself asks and answers this very question at the end of Book 5. 5 years ago, you arrived at Hogwarts, Harry, safe and whole, as I had planned and intended. Well, not quite whole. You had suffered. I knew you would when I left you on your aunt and uncle's doorstep. I knew I was condemning you to 10 dark and difficult years. My answer is that my priority was to keep you alive, and I had to make my decision too with regard to the years ahead. The fact that your mother died to save you meant she gave you a lingering protection that Voldemort never expected, a protection that flows in your veins to this day. I put my trust, therefore, in your mother's blood. I delivered you to her sister, her only remaining relative. She, i.e. Aunt Petunia, may have taken you grudgingly, furiously, unwillingly, bitterly, yet still she took you, and in doing so, she sealed the charm I placed upon you. Your mother's sacrifice made the bond of blood the strongest shield I could give you. While you can still call home the place where your mother's blood dwells, there you cannot be touched or harmed by Voldemort. He shed her blood, but it lives on in you and her sister. Her blood became your refuge. As long as you can still call it home, there he cannot hurt you. Your aunt knows this. I explained what I had done in the letter I left with you on her doorstep. She knows that allowing you house room may well have kept you alive for the past 15 years. 5 years ago, then, you arrived at Hogwarts, neither as happy nor as well-nourished as I would have liked, perhaps, yet alive and healthy. You were not a pampered little prince, but as normal a boy as I could have hoped under the circumstances." End quote. To summarize, Dumbledore knew that Harry might suffer with the Dursleys, but asked Petunia to care for Harry in spite of this because Dumbledore wanted to ensure Harry survived to adulthood. Despite Petunia's distaste for wizards, she took Harry in. Harry lived there for 10 years full-time, then an additional 6 years over the summers. The Dursleys were actively cruel to Harry throughout these periods. Harry did, in fact, survive. It is important to note, however, that there are 2 distinct protections, and it is important not to confuse them. The protection of Lily's sacrifice. That's one. The fact that Harry's mother died to protect Harry meant that Harry could not be touched or harmed specifically by Voldemort. This protection went away once Voldemort took Harry's blood. This has nothing to do with Petunia. Then there's a second protection, and that's the bond of blood charm. This is totally different, and is what Dumbledore described. Briefly, it is a spell cast by Dumbledore that uses the direct bond Harry has with Petunia, i.e. the blood of Lily, as well as Lily's love through her sacrifice, which protects Harry from any harm while he calls 4 Privet Drive his home, and while Harry is at the residence. This is the protection that Petunia provided. This leads us into the following questions. Namely, does Harry have an obligation to be grateful to the Dursleys for taking him in, despite the mistreatment? If he does, In what way, if any, is this obligation mitigated given the mistreatment he suffered at the hands of the Dursleys? If he does not, do we acknowledge the role the Dursleys played in sheltering, feeding, and clothing Harry at their expense and even at personal risk to themselves? Harry appeared to be, for the most part, immune to their neglect. Does the fact that Harry didn't suffer trauma mitigate his terrible upbringing? Also, what further obligation to be grateful does Harry have, given the magical protection the Dursleys provided for him by allowing him to call their house home? Lastly, what if Harry earned an additional benefit of not being corrupted by fame, which may have occurred in another's home where they did in fact care about Harry? This is not an unknown circumstance where people will often suffer because they are raised as very famous people. So this is a protection they provided. Does Harry have an obligation to feel gratitude? Note, Harry's obligation to feel gratitude to the Dursleys is pretty controversial, but let's see how the Torah approaches this dilemma. I am excited to welcome Rabbi Moshe Friedman to this episode to answer our questions. Rabbi Friedman is a Jewish educator, musician, spoken word artist, video essayist, and author. He has spoken and performed for audiences around the world and continues to explore innovative ways of spreading Jewish wisdom through art, music, and media. You can find his work at rav-mo.com and on his YouTube channel, Mensch Sense. I'll include links to both below. Thank you. Thanks so much for joining us. I guess the first question is, does Harry have an obligation to feel gratitude or to express his gratitude towards the Dursleys for taking him in, despite their mistreatment of him?
Okay, so first of all, it's a pleasure to be here with you. And second of all, from what it looks like, based on previous discussions within ultra diehard fans of Harry Potter, what I'm about to say is a highly controversial thing. But the short answer is yes. Yes, Harry does have an obligation. It's not even just a suggestion. It's an obligation for gratitude towards the people who raised him, albeit abusively and not so nicely.
Why is that? Is that just because they gave him house room? So it kind of makes sense. They even actually mention this in different books. I think it was Uncle Vernon's sister says, you should feel grateful. Uncle Vernon himself says in book 4, you should feel grateful. We put clothes on your back, to which Harry responds coldly that they're 4 times the size because they're just Dudley's hand-me-downs. But why does Judaism view it that way? Why does he? I mean, they abused him. He has truly raised him, but they did not do so in a nice way.
Yeah, so I think the basis for this confusion comes from one very simple but absolutely critical distinction, which is what is the point of gratitude? And I want to introduce this concept with a parallel, the way that I approach this from within Jewish law and Jewish perspectives. There's actually quite a close parallel between the situation that you're describing in Harry Potter and a situation in the Torah, which should be well known to many people, that the story of the Jewish people begins in Egypt, ostensibly. The Egyptians at first took in the Jews when they were small in number. The family of Jacob gave them a place to stay at a time when food was scarce, when there was a famine around those surrounding countries. And thanks to the foresight of Joseph, they had stored enough wheat that Egypt became the center of sustenance for most of that part of the world. And Pharaoh graciously allowed the entire family to move there. And for quite some time, they enjoyed a lot of success, a lot of freedom, independence. They were looked at as equals in the society. And then after a certain point, the Torah says after all of the descendants, the direct descendants of Jacob died, all the 12 tribes, sons and the daughter of Israel of Jacob, then the Egyptians started getting nervous, Jews becoming too numerous, and all of a sudden you have what turns out to be the Passover story of Egypt. The Egyptians begin to terrorize and torment the Jews, enslave them, inflict terribly cruel behavior towards them, things that the written Torah does not fully get into, but the oral Torah elaborates on extensively, using children for bricks. We do know that from the story that children are thrown into the river, so there is infanticide. There's all kinds of attempts to destroy family life and the nation as we know it. In due time, they are rescued. Moses and God free the Jewish people. They're now out in the desert reflecting on their time in Egypt, and there is a particular mitzvah, commandment in the Torah that says that you should not treat Egypt and the Egyptians as abominable. You should not detest them. Why? Because you were strangers, you were guests in their land and they fed you and they took care of you. It's absolutely baffling because you're like, what do you mean they took care of you? They murdered you and they used you for free labor and exploited you in every way and shape possible. Far worse, it seems, than the way that the Dursleys treated Harry. Okay, they didn't give him a lot of food and they put him in the cupboard for a bed, but at least they didn't make him do horrific corporal labor that was backbreaking and soul crushing. They allowed him some level of autonomy. So the question then becomes, what on earth is going on here? Is this like a Stockholm syndrome where you fall in love with your captor, where somebody treats you so poorly that you begin to worship them and to idolize them? That clearly can't be the case. So the 20th century educator and scholar, Rabbi Moshe Friedman, also known as the Alter of Slobodka, speaks about this in a larger essay on gratitude, the function of gratitude. And he says that the level of gratitude that we owe towards anyone who gives us a kindness is far beyond what we would normally expect. Somebody does a kindness to you, there's almost no end to how much you're obligated to repay that person. And not only nice people, but not nice people, and even things that people are expected to do for you, such as the bus driver takes you to work. That's his job. Nonetheless, you are obligated to thank profusely and feel a strong debt of gratitude to the bus driver simply for doing his job because he did something nice for you. And culminating in this incredibly bizarre example of the Jewish people requiring gratitude, being obligated to thank and have gratitude towards the Egyptians. So what's going on here? Anyone with modern sentiments would say this is unacceptable. You have no obligation to thank or express any level of gratitude or kindness to the people who so terribly mistreated you. And the reason why we tend to think that, I think, is because we see gratitude as a two-way exchange. There is the person who is gracious and giving the kindness, and there's the person, the recipient of the kindness, and it's almost like a transaction. You do something nice for me, I say thank you back. The Alter of Slobodka says that there is more than meets the eye to what gratitude is for. You see, every component of gratitude, there is an interpersonal relationship that is established when you have a debt of gratitude to somebody. I am obligated to thank you because you did something nice for me. But beyond that, there exists another hidden reason for why we treat gratitude so importantly. And the reason why the Alter of Slobodka says is for the following reason. Ultimately, every kindness that we are shown by other people is a reflection of the ultimate kindnesses that we experience on a daily, constant level by God, by the creator of the universe. We do not deserve or earn our beating hearts and the air we breathe and the water we drink. And for a good part of our lives, 15, 16, 17 years, maybe if you're very mature, 20, 30 years, we do almost nothing to earn our existence on this earth. And yet we are constantly being supported and kept alive by God, and not only being kept alive, but in many cases, kept alive in a very, very indulgent way. People often ask me, how do you know God exists? And tongue in cheek, I say chocolate. And the reason why is because it's entirely possible that our species could survive on food that tastes awful. Worms eat dirt. If we so choose, we could be fed intravenously for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. People eat Huel or whatever that stuff is for 3 meals a day to go on a diet. So we would survive and we would exist as a species if our food tasted horrible. From a biological perspective, if you need to eat, you're going to eat it, even if it tastes terrible. And yet we find on our planet hundreds, thousands of different foods that taste amazing, taste incredible, and taste very different from each other. And this wide range of luxury, delicious sweets that we find growing on trees, literally, is a sign that God is doing more than just keeping us alive, but he's doing it in a way of love, of unbelievable kindness. So every time somebody does something good for us, in the words of the Alter Slobodka, if we don't recognize the good and acknowledge the good that others have done for us, then that's one chip away at our ability to acknowledge the good that God does for us constantly. So our debt of gratitude is not just towards other people, it's also in recognition and in service of that higher debt of gratitude towards God. And I think this changes the whole perspective, because now what we're saying is anytime somebody does something nice for me, even if that comes from a person who seemingly does not deserve our respect at all, nonetheless, the act of kindness, isolated from the rest of that person's behavior, is a chance to exercise our gratitude muscles so that we can use it better and more often in the service of recognizing the goodness of God.
The way I understand this idea is it's not even necessarily a duty to feel gratitude to say like the bus driver. Right? When we feel grateful towards the bus driver for doing his job and getting us to work, it just has more to do with the fact that we want, like you said, to kind of exercise that gratitude muscle. And if we don't, then we'll start getting into the habit of not feeling gratitude towards God.
Yes, well, let's make that a little bit more nuanced. Of course, we want to look at the bus driver and not merely use them as some weight in the gym of the universe to exercise our gratitude muscles so that when it comes time for the real thing, meaning there is some godly element of that bus driver, right? There's something very divine, something inside of that bus driver who feels maybe even on the smallest level, even if he or she doesn't fully realize it, there's something that they enjoy about helping other people, bringing people to and from their jobs, to and from the places that they have to go. As long as that tiny spark of recognition that I'm doing something nice for you and I enjoy that, right? So that requires me to look at the bus driver, not merely as a practice for the real gratitude, but actually to say, you may be doing it 80% for your own reasons, but 20% of you really wants to be good and wants to actually do a kindness. And I think the same thing can be extended to almost anyone. The Dursleys are, for all intents and purposes, really narcissistic, selfish, deluded people with terrible, terrible qualities. And yet, what was it in Petunia, the mother? What was it in her that accepted Harry in the first place, despite the fact that she did it begrudgingly and no one was coercing her? She could have said no. And there was something that she felt as a debt, as a kindness, or in the memory of her sister, or that she had some level of compassion for her nephew. There was something inside of her that sparked her to do the right thing. Am I right about this, or was she really coerced?
Now, you're right. Dumbledore even, to read the exact quote, he says, she may have taken you grudgingly, furiously, unwillingly, bitterly, yet still she took you. So the answer is
yes.
No, she was not forced and she did it grudgingly, but she did do it.
Yeah. Now, in terms of what we've said so far, what we're essentially saying is, yes, these people are 80, 90% terrible people, and they don't have any affinity towards Harry, and they see him as a nuisance. Everything they do is in the worst way possible, simply just not to let him die. But there is some small spark of divinity, even in the Dursleys, that makes them want to be kind, that causes them to continue to feed him and clothe him, even if it's in a way that's totally not ideal. For that alone, it's worthwhile being grateful to them, to that part of them, let's say. And on another level, and on a deeper level, that is a reflection of divine kindness, which if we can learn to recognize that in other people, all the more so we can learn to recognize it in the world around us.
That actually clarifies the question I had, because I was going to say, what if someone were to push back and say, well, look, I don't believe in God, so why should I feel any sense of gratitude? And I think the way I understood it was, it's not only about kind of flexing a muscle in terms of this is how we can come into recognition, like sense of gratitude to God for sustaining us throughout life and giving us delicious food, even though he could give us like sludge. It's about, no, there's a sense of, we see the other person and we feel a sense of, yes, this might be your job and you may not even be a very nice person, but at the end of the day, you are doing something kind for me. And I should appreciate that and respect you for that and recognize that kindness. And by doing so, you will then eventually come to a kind of deeper sense of gratitude to God. But those are almost, they don't need to go together. It's not like the reason why you feel gratitude toward the other person is only as a tool to feel gratitude to God. No, he's an independent person for whom you should feel gratitude. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, I would say the two are layered. There is an interplay between the two, but if you wanted to separate them, I could even add a point three. In other words, there's, at least in Jewish philosophy, there's an understanding that almost everything we do combines three different relationships. One is between oneself and the divine. One is between oneself and other people. And the third is between you and yourself. So when we're talking about the act of showing gratitude, these could play on all three levels. The highest one being that recognizing gratitude from anywhere helps you to be more grateful to God, the universe, however it is that you want to call that. The second one is the person themselves. You're right. They are 99% evil. There's 1% of them that is great. And if I could just double click on that for a second, there is a teaching by the Hasidic master, Rabbi Nachman, one of his most famous teachings, if not his most famous teaching, which is that part of the obligation, there's a Jewish obligation to judge others meritoriously. In other words, to look at them and despite the fact that they may have lots of shortcomings, to focus in and judge that person in a positive light. And he says the reason for that, even though it may be entirely irrational, you see somebody who's clearly being very self-interested, maybe even worse, nonetheless, to try to see them in a positive role, in a positive light, actually does something to the individual themselves.
Sorry, just to clarify, the individual, the person who is seeing them, or the less than desirable person?
When I see you, if I look at you and I look past, sorry, Ophir, you're 99% good with 1% stuff you need to work on. But let's say you were a not so nice individual and you appear to be very arrogant and narcissistic and deceptive and right, whatever. And yet there's something that I see inside of you and I praise you for the little good that you have. Rabbi Nachman says that what that does is that gives energy to the part of you that is good, right? On a psychological level, you could say it conditions you that if you start getting positive feedback about the good things that you do, that will inflate the sense of self that is actually good, and you'll start to behave better. We reward people for the good behavior that they do, and sometimes we may have to punish people or disincentivize people from doing the bad things that they do. But the more I reward you for the good, the more you will start to identify with that part of you that is good. On an interpersonal level, the gratitude that I have towards you, even if you're a terrible person, actually has a positive effect on the person receiving that gratitude. So the first one is the divine. The second one is the way in which I affect other people through my gratitude. And the third one, and this is something that you'll find a lot in all kinds of psychological literature, even amongst atheists, is that simply having gratitude in one's life makes you a happier person. And so you almost have an obligation to be grateful, an obligation to yourself to be grateful, because the more gratitude you express and the more you choose to focus on the kindnesses that people have given to you, the less bitter, the less resentful, the more positive, joyful you will be in your life. So it covers all of those three things.
Definitely adds another level. So it's not only about developing a relationship with other people and with God, it's just about Harry's ability to feel grateful for the Dursleys is actually good for Harry. It helps him grow and I guess makes him look at the world in a different way.
And I think this is a really deep idea. It's a very fundamental idea that I think people forget about a lot when it comes to areas even outside of gratitude. I'll just give one other example. So there's a famous question that's discussed in Jewish circles, and I'm sure even outside of Jewish circles as well, which is if you had 100 coins that you wanted to give away to charity, do you give 100 coins to one person or one coin to 100 people? And now there is quite a lot of debate. If you give 100 coins to one person, maybe they can buy themselves a new suit and get a job interview and actually sustain themselves. Or, you give 100 coins to another person and they can buy a sewing machine and they can start to earn a living themselves. That's fair enough. And then again, there is the element of giving one coin to 100 people. And some people might say, well, what are you doing there? There's very, very little that every individual can buy as a result of those 100 coins. Now, Maimonides, the 12th century scholar, says, one advantage that you have from giving away one coin to 100 people is that every time you give something away, you are training yourself to become more of a giver. Oftentimes, especially in the world today, we see movements like effective altruism, which is how can I make my money go the furthest? And I totally applaud that intention, the desire to want to see your money being used in the most effective way possible. One must include in that equation what the giving does to you, because there's two sides to that equation. There's the recipient of the charity, but there's also the giver themselves. And every act of giving charity and the way in which you give the charity has an effect on you. And we're not trying to create simply good results in this universe. We're trying to create good people. And that's something that I think a lot of people often overlook.
That actually reminds me, I remember hearing in a book, Letters to a Buddhist Jew by Rabbi Dr. Akiva Tatz. And he mentioned that, I don't remember the exact quote, but he said something to the effect of, many people think that the fundamental tenet of religion itself is do good, but Judaism sees it as be good, because it is the nature of the good to do good. If your giving charity turns you into more of a giver, you will then give more because you are now a giver. You have fundamentally changed yourself, and that will change your output.
100%. There will always be things, worthy causes that are deserving of our charity. What's really going to move the needle in terms of human giving is if we raise human beings who want to give. That is maybe ultimately the highest form of charity, because it will automatically necessitate that more people will give charity. And the same thing is true with gratitude. The more gratitude we express, the more we ourselves become people who see the good that's being given to us all the time. And we know from so many different psychological studies that the question, the age-old question of the glass half empty, the glass half full, is a real human psychological trait. Our brains and our minds are entirely capable of shaping the way that we view our world. And two people can be in exactly the same situation. One of them is miserable, feels like they're the victim of everything and that they are the unluckiest person in the world. And the other person says, wow, I am so blessed, so blessed to be where I am.
Getting back into it, I guess, does the Dursleys' mistreatment of Harry, these are beautiful ideas, but then you get the facts in the ground and you see the Dursleys like borderline starving Harry, forcing him to work outside and garden their weeds. And this kid's like not even a teenager, right? I mean, it's almost cruel. Dumbledore confronts the Dursleys at the beginning of book 6 and was like, you treated him horribly. And it's true. It happens to be that Harry escaped more or less undamaged, but ideally, absolutely, Harry should feel the sense of gratitude. But the facts on the ground are he was so poorly treated. Is this kind of like, look, I feel gratitude in my heart and I never want to see them again? Does he have to express that gratitude?
So I want to now turn to another area of Jewish law that I think can help us understand this question, which is one of the 10 commandments, to honor your mother and father. You may not be so surprised to learn that there are countless circumstances, times in history where people have come to a rabbi or their advisor and said, Rabbi, what do I do? My parents are terribly abusive people. Do I have an obligation to honor them? So the literature there is multivaried and diverse. There are a lot of opinions, but I will select for you a couple of the more prominent opinions and share with you that indeed many of the greatest Jewish legal authorities of their age have said that while they are in the act, while you are still actively in that abusive relationship, you don't have to be, smacked on the face and then stand up and say, thank you so much for giving me the clothes on my back. That's a masochistic way of behaving, and it's something that is not expected of anybody. However, once you have, let's say, moved out, and once you're no longer engaged in that abusive relationship, let's say Harry Potter is now in his 30s and he's well moved out of the Dursleys' house and self-sufficient. It could be that Harry still does have an obligation even to express the gratitude that he had for whatever kindnesses he did receive. He is still obligated to express that gratitude, especially as the Dursleys are in loco parentis. They're acting as his legal guardians when he's an orphan. It's possible that even according to some opinions, they even take the status of parental figures in that equation. And again, the reasons are those that we've said already. Number one, because it will make Harry himself a happier person. Number two, because the more he emphasizes the good that the Dursleys have done to him, the more potential it has that the Dursleys themselves can change. Because we do believe that nobody is beyond, or almost nobody is beyond being helped. And number three, which is incredibly important here, is that we know that the 10 commandments are broken up on the 2 tablets, 5 and 5. And surprisingly, according to Jewish tradition, the commandment to honor your mother and father is on the first tablet, along with, I am your God, don't worship other idols, don't take the Lord's name in vain, and keep Shabbat. These are all mitzvahs that have to do entirely with God. And so it's surprising to see honoring your mother and father on that set of tablets, as opposed to the second set, which has don't murder, don't steal, don't commit adultery, all the things that are interpersonal. And the answer that is famously given from multiple sources is honoring your mother and father is ultimately at the source a way of honoring God, especially because your biological parents are very much a reflection of the relationship that you have with God. Just as they quite literally brought you into the world, so too God brought you into the world. We have an extra requirement to treat our parents with the reverence that is a small, dim reflection of the reverence that we have for Hashem for no other reason than the fact that they are our parents. So it's probably more complicated than that. The question of whether the Dursleys actually legally fit that description of being his de facto parents, that's probably a question that's for another time. But in any case, yes, once he's out of the abusive relationship, once he's no longer in harm's way, he may still indeed have an obligation to express that gratitude.
What would that look like? How would he go about expressing that gratitude?
Maybe at the minimal level, it may be a thank you, a birthday card or something like that, remembering them at auspicious occasions, but in behavior as well. Now, again, I'll add the caveat that some things apply only to one's parents and not to one's legal guardians. And I'll also add the caveat that some of the examples that I'm about to provide might be outdated and no longer practiced in our particular societies. But for example, a child, as part of the obligation of honoring one's mother and father, has a requirement that when a parent walks into the room, the child should stand up for them. So in that situation, even if the parents were abusive in the past, but now let's say he's no longer at risk of that, he may still have the obligation to stand up for them in the room. You could take that as far as you want, that he still has an obligation when he encounters them to treat them with respect and with reverence and even with kindness. It's not like every time he sees them, he has to shun them and slap them in the face. Now, let's add one more condition here, which is that this is assuming that Harry hasn't suffered serious long-term mental health deleterious effects as a result of the ill treatment of the Dursleys. If every time he sees the Dursleys, it triggers some inner trauma and causes him to have serious mental health problems, then I would say I don't think anybody has an obligation to harm themselves in order to show somebody else respect and deference. There is a limit to how much we have to suffer as a result of the obligation of gratitude.
That is a really important point. Harry does not like the Dursleys, but it thankfully does not sound like perhaps I'm just completely misreading the text, but I didn't track that, but that is a really important caveat. So thanks for clarifying. This may or may not apply to the Dursleys because they are not his biological parents. So just to clarify, there is potentially a difference between biological parents and your legal guardians.
This is where it gets very complicated. And of course, when you have 2 Jews, you have 3 opinions. And so you will have some rabbis throughout history who have said that if I adopt a child, then I am, for all intents and purposes, that person's father. At least legally speaking, from a halachic point of view, from a Jewish legal point of view. Maybe in certain areas such as inheritance and things like that, it might be more complicated. But when it comes to honoring one's mother and father, you will find opinions that say that if you're an adopted child of 2 parents, then even if they're not your biological parents, you still have an obligation to honor them. Somebody who has raised you, at least to some extent, does have the status of a parent and is deserving of at least some of the respect that you would afford to your biological parents.
So you mentioned once Harry is in his 30s and he leaves that he's no longer dependent upon them. He's self-sustaining. We see in the books that he does come back. He's mostly away, right? He lives at Hogwarts for like 10 months of the year, but for 2 months in the summer, he comes back. In some of these interactions, Harry does respond. He responds coldly. He gets angry. I guess, how does that manifest when he is back home? He's not home for long, right? He may be home for a month or two over the summer. At that point, does he still have an obligation to show gratitude? Is he allowed to respond to their insults and their mistreatment of him? That's kind of, I guess, curious to see in that in-between space. He's not out of the house yet, but he's kind of mostly out of the house. So what happens? And they are actively protecting. The simple fact that he's in their house is showing him protection. So it's almost like, oh, they're being rude. He doesn't have any obligation to show respect. But the simple fact that he's there is probably a big part of the reason why he's alive.
So I think we go back to the principles that we stated already, right? So number one, if you are the object of abuse currently, then there's only so much that can be expected of you. We'll bring in one more Jewish law, which is that you're not allowed to take revenge. And one of the medieval commentaries, it's called the Sefer HaChinuch, the Book of Education, says that this only extends so far. To be insulted and not insult back is such a difficult test that is only on the level of angelic beings who are capable of doing such things. So he says that the Torah doesn't expect us to be angels. And so when I am ridiculed, humiliated, screamed at to my face, I'm not expected to just turn the other cheek and smile and say, thank you so much for keeping me at home and for keeping me alive. There are people in history who have accomplished that and who have risen to such levels. You know, there's always the letter of the law and above the letter of the law. Certainly the letter of the law does not expect Harry to just wear it with a smile on his face and only look for the good. When he's in the middle of that abusive relationship, he's allowed to defend himself. He's allowed to protect himself, even emotionally. And if that requires being cold to them and trying to resist their cruelty, then that's entirely possible and probably necessary.
I guess there's one other level potentially of gratitude Harry might feel in terms of this is also mentioned by Dumbledore. I think it's actually the first chapter of Harry Potter where Harry's parents are dead, Voldemort is gone, and Professor McGonagall is kind of sitting watching the Dursleys all day as a cat. And then Dumbledore comes and meets her. When Dumbledore says that he wants to leave Harry there, McGonagall is like shocked. She's like, these people are nothing like us. They're terrible people. And Dumbledore is like, and moreover, because they're nothing like us, they're not going to raise him as knowing that he's a wizard and he's not going to know anything about who he is. And Harry Potter is already a legend. Like it's been like a day, if that, and everybody already knows his name and his toasting game. And Dumbledore says, to read it verbatim, McGonagall says, I wouldn't be surprised if today was known as Harry Potter Day in the future. There will be books written about Harry. Every child in our world will know his name. Dumbledore responds, exactly. It would be enough to turn any boy's head. Famous before he can walk and talk. Famous for something he won't even remember. Can't you see how much better off he'll be growing up away from all that until he's ready to take it? And then if I could just conclude with one more quote, he says, 5 years ago, then you arrived at Hogwarts, neither as happy nor as well-nourished as I would have liked, perhaps, yet alive and healthy. You are not a pampered little prince, but as normal boys I could have hoped under the circumstances. Say what you will about the Dursleys. They were terrible. They were cruel. But it's not hard to take a look to see what happens to child celebrities. This isn't exactly an unfamiliar phenomenon where that tends to end poorly. And yet, you could say that they actually saved him from that. As it's like terrible, we're not endorsing that kind of behavior towards children, but that I think is a fact that needs to be acknowledged. They did in a way save him from his own fame.
Yeah, this is a great point. In order to address it, I want to allude back to the Egypt story. We thank God every year on the holiday of Pesach, Passover, for taking us out of Egypt, knowing full well, or maybe some people don't realize it, but one could ask the question, why are we praising and thanking God for having taken us out of Egypt? He's the one who put us there in the first place, right? There was a promise to Abraham that God makes that says your children are going to be enslaved, basically saying, I'm going to put them there. The question is, how can we have gratitude to God if he's made us suffer such a cruel fate? And the answer is that were it not for the slavery in Egypt, we wouldn't be the people that we are. It humbled us. It forged us through the crucible of fire, as the verses say, made us people who were willing and ready and able to accept upon ourselves no longer a tyrant of a master, but now a great, gracious God as a master. And so as a result of that, we could not be the Jewish people had we not gone through the Egypt experience. That alone may give us reason to praise God and to thank God as the orchestrator of all of this. Similarly, it may give Harry a reason to praise Dumbledore and to thank Dumbledore for having had the foresight to not allowing him to be raised as a pampered prince and as a boy who's so self-obsessed because of how everyone would have treated him in the wizard world. I don't think you can turn around and say, thank you to the Dursleys for treating me so terribly because now it made me who I am. That, I think, is going a bit far. Even then, I want to add one more point to this, which is that it sounds like from the story that Dumbledore, he did what he did. He put Harry with the Dursleys. Even he acknowledged that it wasn't an ideal situation. Let's say that Harry's mother had another sister who was warm and loving and gentle and kind and would have raised Harry nicely without treating him like a celebrity. Dumbledore would have chosen that option.
I actually think that's explicit. That's part of his rebuke to them in book 6 when he's like, I asked you to treat him as your own son and you failed colossally. Not his words, but that's pretty much what he said.
Yeah. So this was the best of bad situations, right? There were no good options here. And so it's not like Dumbledore intentionally put him into a very difficult and challenging upbringing because he knew that that would make him a better person. I think only God can do that. We don't believe in the ends justify the means. You don't want to give somebody horrific, terrible experiences because it's going to make them a stronger person. You can do that on a small level in the same way that we exercise in the gym in a very measured way. We cause micro tears in our muscles in order to build them back stronger. And we know that every now and then being pushed a little bit past our comfort zone is a good thing. It's a very, very healthy thing. But there's no sane parent who would throw their 7-year-old in the wilderness and say, find your way back home because it's going to turn you into a man. That's cruel. That's unbelievably cruel. We have to be reasonable people here. Number one, the Dursleys, I don't think deserve the credit for mistreating Harry, even though that made him a humble person. In the same way that we don't thank the Egyptians for their cruelty to the Jewish people. We thank them for the kindnesses. We thank them for having clothed us and fed us and given us shelter and all of that stuff. But we don't thank them for the mistreatment. And the second thing is, the only reason why we thank God for such a thing is because God, who is an omniscient being, who sees past, present, and future, and has perfect information about the outcomes of his decision, he's the only one who's capable of doing something that seems to be cruel now so that it turns out good later. We ourselves, we can't, murder an innocent person now because it may save future innocent people in the future. We cannot do that as human beings.
So first, that actually is really interesting because I was going to ask, what's the source of obligation of gratitude towards the Egyptians? And you clarified, it's the kindnesses they did, not the fact that their mistreatment happened to have a nice effect. You don't get credit for that. I heard from Rav Emanuel Bernstein. He has a commentary on the Haggadah for Passover. He actually asked this question about the Egyptians. Why are we thanking God for redeeming us from Egypt when you put us there? So his analogy was something to the effect of, if a doctor heals your broken bone, then you're grateful. If that doctor broke your bone and then healed it, you don't feel grateful for that because they're the one who broke it to begin with. However, if they broke your bone in order to get to a vital organ, save that vital organ, and then heal your bone, then of course you feel grateful. You're not going to get angry at him for breaking your bone. The fact that he broke it is what was necessary to save you. So that kind of sounds like the same idea in terms of God brought us down into Egypt, which was a painful experience, but it was necessary for a deeper process to happen.
I love it. I mean, he doesn't need my praise or my approbation, but very beautiful metaphor.
Was there any other point you want to touch on when it came to the Dursleys or gratitude here?
Just to reiterate my statement, which is that we so often forget that the way that we treat other people, first of all, has an untold effect to them. Our gratitude towards other people is not just because we owe them. It's not just because it's a transaction. It's because we have a faith that if I choose to treat people in a positive way, it will in some small way encourage them to be more positive in the future. And that I am so much the creator of my own reality. And the more I choose to see the good in the world, it's such a cliche, but it is backed by so much scientific evidence that the more I choose to look at the positives in my life, the more I will feel better, feel blessed, feel like I am, a wealthy person because of all the goodness that I've received. And the more I practice acts of gratitude, Jews wake up every single morning and they're thankful for the shoes on their feet and for being able to walk and being able to see. And these are such small things, but how much would you pay to be able to see if you were blind? The number is incalculable. You'd probably spend many, many fortunes to be able to see if you were blind. And the fact that we get to see every day is an unquantifiable gift. So let's just remember that gratitude has positive effects in almost every area of our lives.
And this beautiful sign off. Thank you so much, Rabbi Friedman. It's been a pleasure having you, and thanks for taking the time.
It was wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you for tuning in to the Dilemmas on Screen, a Jewish Perspective podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. If you have any suggestions for a moral dilemma you'd like analyzed, feel free to send it over. Thanks again, and see you next time.